Now, so far, we have spoken about one aspect of attention, which is that of selective attention. So, the idea of focusing on one thing and trying to inhibit other things. But a different aspect of attention is that of divided attention. And you see that pictured in this funny picture on the side. It's the idea of concurrently paying attention to multiple things at the same time. This is often referred to as multitasking, with the idea that we're just doing multiple things at the same time. Um, Although, as I will show briefly, whether it is true that we actually can multitask is not necessarily clear. Now, using simulations, a lot of attention has been paid on how does doing multiple tasks at the same time affect our ability to drive properly, since it's something that has very clear and very direct repercussions. And so, using driving simulators, researchers have looked at how well people can drive while they're doing one or more tasks. In particular, in this experiment I want to show, that is reported also in the book, they were really looking at the difference between listening to the radio, talking with a passenger, or using a cell phone. And it turns out they were looking at the percentage of errors they would make in staying in their lane. And it turns out that when participants were talking on the cell phone, they were less likely to stay in their lane as compared to if they were having a conversation with a passenger. In fact, it turns out in other studies that the amount of mistakes and the probability of entering an accident when talking on the cell phone is actually comparable to the increasing probability that you get if you are driving while intoxicated. And see, interestingly, for a period of time, people thought that the major problem was having to hold with your hand the phone and keeping that by your ear. And the idea was that that would detract from your ability to steer the wheel and therefore, for example, stay in your lane. Turns out, researchers have tested drivers' ability to notice red lights as well as the average braking time, comparing participants as they were using either a handheld phone or a hands-free phone, so with a Bluetooth, or listening to the radio. It turns out that whether you're using a handheld or a hands-free device doesn't actually make a big difference. There's a great impairment in both tasks. In fact, drivers were nearly twice as likely to miss the stop signs when they were talking on the phone, regardless of whether handheld or hand-free. And in fact, they were 10% slower to braking when they were talking on the phone compared to listening to the radio or listening to an audiobook. So it's not about holding something to your ear. It's probably a problem of processing resources. So the ability to allocate your attention truly to multiple things at the same time. In fact, it's controversial whether people can truly multitask or not. There sure is some evidence that people can pay attention to multiple objects at the same time. There's a wonderful demo in your book. And typically the finding is that people can maybe keep track of 4 or 5 things at the same time. However, there's some research that also suggests that when people multitask, they don't really multitask. Rather, what they're doing is they're rapidly switching in between tasks. And obviously, switching in between tasks always comes to a cost. Furthermore, it's just not that simple. It's not like you have, one big pool of attention and you can fraction it between, well, this task and that task and that task, and if you deplete it, then you're out of luck. It looks like there are many other aspects of what you're doing that are very important. For example, whether imagine you're doing two tasks at the same time. If they are, the more similar they are, the harder it is to do two tasks at the same time. The more dissimilar they are, the easier it is to do two tasks at the same time. Compare, for example, the idea of listening to an audiobook while driving compared to looking at your phone while driving. In the case of listening to an audiobook and driving, they're occupying different modalities. One is obviously auditory, the other one is more motor in nature. And so it looks like you can, to some extent, fraction your attention between those two. It's very hard to fraction your attention between driving and having your hands on the wheel and looking at the road, and also looking at your phone, which you have to hold in your hand in order to, let's say, text. So when two tasks are in a similar modality, they interfere more. Also, how hard the tasks you're doing are is very important. Obviously, doing two concurrent but easy tasks is easier to do than doing an easy and a complex one. Just to give you a silly example, compare driving. In fact, driving while talking to the passenger versus driving while conducting an interview over the phone. Right? Clearly, one of the two tasks is just requiring so much more of your attention that it will drain attention away from the concurrent task. Finally, practice seems to play a very important role. In fact, Liz Spelke in 1976 taught participants to do a pretty complicated task. Essentially, you have to read and understand some short passages, and at the same time, somebody is dictating words to you, and you have to write them down. So clearly, these are two tasks that interfere a lot. These are two tasks that are very difficult to do at the same time. Yet, over the span of 6 weeks, participants became much, much better at the task. So clearly, practice, there's an important aspect of learning and practice to being able to carry out multiple tasks at the same time. In other words, to be able to divide your attention.